So first I did want to say thanks to Casey. I've heard about Siege for such a long time. I've heard about this conference and this community, and I've always been really curious about it. I've had a lot of difficulty getting out here for it, so this is my first time here, and I'm really appreciative to see this corner of the industry, because it's well known throughout the rest of the industry as being this very unique place, and I think I really see that when I walk around the expo floor and see the cool stuff you guys are building. So I'm really happy to be here. Molly was extremely helpful. Thank you so much for helping me kind of put together what you guys might want to hear. I don't know if I got it right, but we'll see, and I'm really pleased to be here. I thought I'd give an agenda because I'm certainly not going to just talk at you for 90 minutes. It's a really long time. I don't think you can probably read it from there because I got too many items, but I'm going to talk about my story, my company, Glasslab, where I've been working the past 3 years, and then kind of break for Q&A, and then talk about some remote teamwork and about mission-driven games, and about some the design work that I've been doing more recently, which is about that mission-driven focus and trying to kind of make a game that has another effect on the world and kind of the reputation of those games previously. So I'll start with my story, and I've just got these bookends on the slides. This is kind of how I describe who I am. Again, you guys are pretty far away from that, but it's a graph because I find that people believe things when you put them in a graph. And I've got what I was working on kind of punctuated in time, and if you could kind of see it close up, what you would see is that I'm really interested in things when they're first starting out, and when nobody knows what they're doing, and they're kind of like nobody believes that it's even worth looking into. And then right when it starts to really take off, I leave. And that's really fun for not being bored, so I'm not bored most of the time. It's not so good for making a lot of money, but so long as you don't care about that, it works out. But there's another angle on my perspective, which is that I'm a fourth-generation immigrant. That is actually a triptych on the right of my great-great-grandfather, who was some kind of Japanese war hero. So somewhere there's some blue blood in my family, but then my family wound up on a dock, because the little baby that's in the center of the second picture is my grandfather, who actually literally grew up on a dock in San Diego. And if it weren't for the IGDA scholarship and a series of scholarships I got to go to college, I certainly would not be here at all. And the IGDA itself is actually directly instrumental in getting me into the industry. So I think that's interesting, especially if we're going to talk about social change, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, that this was social change at work. And all of any impact that I made, by the way, how many of you, I'm actually curious, knew who I was before today? Some. Okay, that's good. That's good. But a lot of people don't. I'm well known within the game industry from a certain period in time. And that time is fading, and that's perfectly cool with me. So I'm pleased that you don't know who I am yet. But any of that impact is directly related to this thing the IGDA did, which was the GDC scholarship. So this is kind of a brief history of what I did, where in the top right you have a Commodore 64 that my parents gave me when I was 2, and I'm pretty sure I learned to read on that computer. And I kind of never got away from it. I was a giant nerd in high school. I had online writing groups when I was about 15 years old, and one of the online writing groups, it started to need rules because people were getting kind of mean to each other, so I started making up rules for how they should kind of interact and how we should create characters, because people were making these all-powerful characters. It's kind of the same old game design story. So I kind of put some constraints and said, we're going to roll some dice, and there's going to be some randomness, and it was kind of reverse engineering a sort of Dungeons & Dragons thing when I had no idea what Dungeons & Dragons was, despite being on the internet and being a nerd, which is really kind of remarkable. And a friend of mine in that group said, you need to play this text-based game called Gemstone, which was built by a company called Simutronics, which is actually out of St. Louis out here. And I started playing it, and I died immediately, and I said, this game sucks. And I started playing another of the Simutronics game called Dragon Realms, which was kind of another iteration of the same property. So it was a little bit smoother, and I didn't die immediately, and so I started to play it, and then wound up playing it so much that I did once fake being sick so that I could stay home and play it instead of going to school, which my parents, I don't think that they know that still. And I played it so much that eventually there was a call that went out to the people that played the game. We're looking for developers, which is this is the thing that happened with online games. Even, I think to some extent it still happens today. If you want to work for League of Legends, the best thing to do is play a crap load of League of Legends. And I applied, and they said, we like your writing, partly from the online writing group, and hired me as a developer. So I was a remote developer throughout college, having no idea that this was a job. I thought that I was making up things and extending this world, and it was fun, and it was actually more fun than playing, because I had gotten to such a high level as a player that it wasn't as fun anymore for me to just consume the content of the game. So then I actually got that IGDA scholarship once I realized, oh, people actually think this is work, and went to San Francisco, went to the GDC, and really I actually had been on track to get go into a PhD program in philosophy. And I got a job in the game industry instead, which paid almost nothing, which kind of horrified my parents. But I started in QA, moved quickly into design. And this is the bottom, kind of like the middle big thing here is an article I wrote for The Escapist called Cyberpunk: The Fall of Black Nine, which is it was about my first game development experience in the professional space. And so I worked for a company called Taldron. We had a really bad publisher. The team was not super experienced, and it went down pretty hard. And so I had this very shocking experience in the game industry initially. After that, EA actually came through and kind of swept up a lot of our programmers, which they'll tend to do. The company was folding, so they came and hired everybody. So my fiance at the time got hired by EA and immediately went into 13-hour days. I believe this is a long time ago. So this is actually, I'm already talking about it. This is actually why I don't talk about this anymore. I wrote a blog post. The blog post got spread really far and wide. It was about working conditions inside the game industry. It got covered by the New York Times and the LA Times. People were really shocked, which I kind of wasn't shocked by, but people outside were shocked that the working conditions got so brutal. And in this particular case, had gotten brutal from the day that he started. 6 months before the game was supposed to ship. So that was actually kind of unusual, but it was becoming more and more common. And the reason why I don't talk about it is because it was 2004. Who's this? It's Usher. Yeah, Usher's great, but Usher's 2004. I mean, he's still doing work now, but it's kind of like, I kind of feel like we should be moving past this stuff. So, but I can say, sorry if you guys like Usher, I didn't mean to he's great. But there is kind of, I can do an FAQ about things that people often ask me about this. One of them is that, has the industry changed? And the answer is, yeah, it goes up and down. It depends on how the money's going. It directly affects our lives. Do I think I made a difference? I feel like I was the center of a storm. I was in a particular place, I said a certain thing, and it kind of revved up. I think there was a difference that was made. The other thing that people ask me if they know about the story, which I know probably actually most of you guys don't, is why I'm working on the EA campus right now, because I am. And it's because EA is actually providing support for some really interesting work, which I'll talk about later. And what we should learn is the thing that nobody does ask, but I kind of wish they would, which is, I think it's really important for game developers to own their own destiny and to not have a relationship with companies and with publishers that is very teenager-like and full of animosity where they're the enemy. I think we have to take ownership for our destiny. I think we have to understand the business that we're in and that it is a business if we want to make money. If you don't, then that's great. And don't work for, I use a bad word here, but you could say jerks. And also something that a philosophy professor told me in college, when he found out about all this stuff that had happened to me, he said labor begets all wealth, which is certainly true. And so because labor begets all wealth, people who produce things have a lot of power. They often are not aware of the power that they have. So that's what I think we should learn from the whole thing. That we have a duty to each other and to society to stand up for each other and to protect each other. So this is a little bit about my company, since if I'm standing up here, I get to talk about things that I want to talk about. And it's just me and my co-founder as core employees. We actually do have 3 full-time people right now, and then an extension of about 5 or 6 contractors that are an assortment of full-time and part-time. My co-founder and I met at that first company, which was called Taldron in Los Angeles, and we worked together intermittently over the years, which if you're in the industry, you'll find is true. You kind of come back together with the same people sometimes. And one time, when we were working for a dog who shall not be named, we were wondering, as the game industry social games were on the rise, this company was making more money than anybody had ever seen, I think ever even conceived, except for maybe Blizzard at that time. And we just started to wonder, actually, could the science that's being used and applied to these games be used for something good, instead of just making money? Just making money is great, but maybe there was a lot more potential than that. And also, we had been working in free-to-play games. We had a game called Go Pets very early on, which was kind of a virtual pet thing. It was a little bit like if you ever played Cats, where you had a little cat walking around on your desktop. This was like Cats, but it was on the internet. So you could send your cat to Beijing, and the cat would actually be on somebody's desktop in Beijing and could come back to you. So we were working on free-to-play games, and one of the things that we saw within that game community was that people who had a lot of money or a lot of disposable income would buy our microtransaction objects, which we were doing microtransactions in 2003, which was unwise. It hadn't quite hit yet, and now it's fully here. But the people that had more money were buying all these objects, and yet we also had a community of players that were the free players, and they were in constant conversation and relationships with these players who had money. So it was this little microcosm of an economic system. And one of the things that we saw was that people were exchanging different things for currency. So people who, it is similar, we saw this recapitulated with gold farming in World of Warcraft, where people who had a lot of time and could mine a lot of things were selling them to people who might not have had time, but they had money. And it kind of made us think, that's an interesting economic dynamic that's happening in this game. Could we actually use it to achieve equity in education? And we've gone around and talked to some people about this, and we think actually maybe you can. So we came up with this concept, which is Sense of Wonder, and we wanted to try to make free-to-play educational equity games, and that is our mission. It's quite difficult, to have a mission-oriented company, and we're on a very slow track. We started about 3 years ago, and we're still kind of just getting off the ground. But that's another thing that I've learned about the mission-based space. We actually first built a game called Snow Day, which we still haven't released yet, which is a problem. We're going to put it out, I think, this November, finally, because it's a pretty brutal place in the mobile casual market right now. But it has a lot of cool features that I like. It has asynchronous multiplayer, but it's an action-feeling game. It's pretty highly polished. We had some good friends who did the art for us. And we proved out our technology. So we kind of created a foundation. We wanted to make a really simple game that would just be fun to regular players, and so show that we could actually ship something on our technology. And the problem, of course, if any of you are making mobile casual games, is that mobile casual was great in 2003 when we started it, and it's not great right now at all. So the cost per acquisition of a new user, if you're going to actually run advertisements and get people to play your game, it's gotten through the roof expensive. The space itself is kind of interestingly dominated by the mid-core market. So if we're advertising to people that are looking for games, they're looking for Clash of Clans. They're not looking for a cute little game where you're skiing with your friends. So what I would say that we learned about that is that you can fiddle with something forever. This is a classic mistake, but we managed to make it anyway. And the longer you fiddle, the less you're going to learn. So if you can finish something, keep it really tight, keep it simple, but actually get it out the door, and especially a mobile game in 6 months or less, I think is what you've got to do. But meanwhile, we're actually working on grant-funded games and are in collaboration with some educators at Indiana University to pitch a game called Reef Keeper, which is a simulation of the ocean that we'll use to kind of teach climate change and a lot of dynamics about the ocean. We think it's a really cool idea. And we're on this very long time frame of applying to the NSF for funding for that. We're in a second round now. It's going to take another year. These time frames for educational nonprofit funding are really, really long, but it's a really interesting process. And the other thing that we're working on is a Cal Humanities project that is intended to connect two places. So my grandfather you saw in the picture as a baby he's Japanese. He was interned in the 1940s, so he's kind of put in a camp in the desert, which was super not cool. And that park is actually being preserved now. The camps are being created into national parks where people can visit and kind of learn about what happened. What we want to do with this project is create actually a text-based online game that allows people that are there in the national park and in the Japanese Historical Museum in Los Angeles and in a garden in San Diego where I grew up to all talk to each other through the context of this game. So to actually explore the game itself and then encounter other people who have been given Japanese names and are kind of having this experience. Meanwhile, this is my team, and we're super all over the place. So one of the things when I was talking to Molly about what might be interesting to talk about here is the future of teams that are not located in the same place and how you get games done when you're not face-to-face every day. It's extra challenging for sure. But despite the fact that we've had a lot of struggle, we're still sticking in there and have actually grown to a good number of people now as we build these relationships as a company. So Glasslab, which, has anybody heard of Glasslab here? I would actually bet not. Well, Ian has heard, a couple people. Yeah, it's not well known within the game industry because it's kind of a strange thing. So this is what Glasslab is. These are the 3 games that I've made over the past 3 years. I had this really down because I would go and talk about this stuff, but now I've been talking about other stuff. So it was founded in 2012. It's 3 years old. It was started by the Entertainment Software Association, ESA. Do you guys know what the ESA is? Yeah, mostly, cool. So the ESA it's actually a lobbyist group for the game industry, which is kind of amazing that we have that. We didn't always have it, and it does a lot of good work now. They introduced these funders, in this case the MacArthur Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, these 2 gigantic philanthropic partners, to the industry, and said, industry, can you make a thing? Can you make really good things? Because you guys make things that are fun for kids, and we need if education would be fun. And actually, EA was the only company that after several years stepped up to the plate And I think that they actually deserve a lot of respect for that. So they were housed at Electronic Arts, and it was a $10 million initiative to get commercial game developers together with these leading people in learning science and assessment data, which I'll talk about in a second, to make video games. And it was kind of crazy. The idea was that school is really boring, and video game people make things that are not boring, so maybe they could make school not boring. And maybe we could use big data, so all the data that comes out of a video game, 60 frames a second, and actually analyze that for what's happening inside the game, and then reflect that back to players so that they're actually learning at an accelerated rate. It was crazy, but I think it's a very humanist idea. It was this notion that video games are the native language of young people now, and that maybe we should be speaking their native language. Maybe if what they really care about are video games and mobile applications and Instagram, maybe we should honor that instead of seeing it as the enemy. So we were given SimCity, and we said, SimCity's awesome. We can do whatever we want with SimCity. There are so many things that we could teach. And then we put it in front of kids, as our part of our iterative playtesting process. And the kids said, this is pretty fun, but we're not learning anything. And we said, oh, crap. It turns out they actually were learning a lot, but they didn't have words for what they were learning, because what they were learning are things like systems thinking and complex problem solving. And that wasn't part of the existing school curriculum. So that's one of the things that we've been up against as part of Glasslab. And I can tell you some of the secrets of SimCity. What is the primary action you take in SimCity? You build buildings? It's watch. Are you a ringer? Yeah. The main thing you do in SimCity is watch, which, if you're trying to gather data from a game based on what you think people are doing, is really difficult because there's no data out of watching. It's actually kind of a fishbowl. So you do something in SimCity, and then you kind of see what happens. And the majority of your time, you just are sitting there looking at SimCity. And it's beautiful and fascinating, but it actually turns out to be not as action-based in its learning as we really thought it was, which we should have realized. Also, it's full of lies. Sorry. So when we talked about SimCity and what we might teach, we said, oh, the power grid would be great. They'll learn about energy. And we put it in front of somebody who actually understood power grids. And they said, well, this is all wrong. And we said, well, of course it is. I mean, it can't possibly be right. So what's fascinating to me about this process is that we thought so much more was going on in SimCity than was actually going on. And if you think about it deeply, of course it all falls apart. But what a brilliant illusion they were able to build, and that feeling that they installed. So we kind of realized that we have to home in on that feeling. And what is it about the feeling of SimCity that is so transformative? Because SimCity has been in schools for a very long time. There's even a thing called a Future Cities competition where they would take SimCity 3,000, 2,000? Maybe, one of those, and actually have kids build a city and describe the infrastructure of their city based on it. The other thing that we learned when we started out to do this was that, holy crap, there's all this data comes out of. This is actually a screenshot of some of the data. Each one of these lines is a data stream from an individual kid playing our game. And our assessment scientists thought they were ready for this, and they totally weren't. Nobody was. So they were actually having to assess these data points. If you think about what an assessment expert does, they're carefully crafting a test that has 4 data points per question, one of 4 answers that you're going to select on a bubble test. They are not ready for this. So one of the things that we wanted to do with our second game was kind of flip that process upside down. So we knew that SimCity kind of just had to be what it was. We were not going to be able to bend it to teach argumentation or very much. There was some actual environmental science in it. We were able to capture that. But mostly, the game was what it was, and we could assess what was going on inside of that, but even that was super, super difficult. So instead, with our second product, we wanted to start from the ground and start with a competency, figure out something that teachers were really struggling to teach, and build a game around it. So we wanted to create an original IP that was built specifically for that purpose. We wanted to collaborate with NASA, because NASA, and the National Writing Project, because they're also awesome. So we made a game called Mars Generation 1 Archibot Academy, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But we built the core loop based on a purposeful competency. So we designed it around argumentation, because teachers have a really hard time teaching argumentation. And we mapped that competency to game interaction. So for every action you take in the game, there's a reason why you're taking that action. Every verb that is there, we are assessing purposefully because we think there's particular feedback that we can get that will tell us about what you're learning and what you're thinking. So it was an abstract idea like argumentation that was turned very mechanical by the way that we framed it. And I really think that this is actually a new kind of game design. This is, oh, I guess my slides don't completely show here, but you can see the ETS in the corner. One of our researchers at Educational Testing Service built this graph, which I think is terrific. It takes the argumentation skill and divides that into the map of the sub-skills that you need to be an effective arguer, essentially, and then the sub-skills, and then matches all of those to our core verbs. So we built a Pokemon-based game where you master different kinds of robots that represent arguments, and that you battle them against each other. So the main things that you do are explore your environment to search for evidence, you equip your robot with the evidence that you find, and then you do battle. And all of these things directly correlate to the competencies that were pulled out by our learning designers from a lot of science about argumentation. So the question for a game that is supposed to educate is, did it work, and can you prove it? Which had been very difficult with SimCity. We got some results that were pulled out of the research of it, but it was really hard. But in the case of Mars Generation 1, we were able to see really measurable gains in our study. So it actually turned out that we got it. And when this evidence came back, it was like, okay, all the stuff we've been doing is worth it. Because you can see in gray, this was the distribution of the kids on the pre-test when they started, and then the distribution in green on the post-test when they finished in argumentation, which was considered to be a very intractable skill. So, and then finally, more recently, we shipped in April Ratio Rancher, where we kind of wanted to take that same process and said, okay, we think we figured it out. Can we do it faster? And can we do it in such a format as to affect more kids? At the time that we were building Mars Generation 1, lots of schools were getting iPads. By the time we were shipping Mars Generation 1, they were actually getting rid of their iPads. It wasn't even like we could ship it to the ones that were still there. They were actually pushing them down to elementary school because iPads are better in elementary school, and exchanging them for Chromebooks, which are cheaper and tougher. Kid drops them, they don't shatter, that kind of thing. So the Chromebook has a lot of constraints, but we built a web-based HTML5 game with a core mechanic inspired by a Montessori pegboard to teach ratios and proportions, which ratios and proportions, as we try to figure out what kind of game we want to make, we are asking teachers what's difficult to teach, and we're also asking education scientists who do work on things like the NAEP and the standardized tests, what is the point where kids all tend to fall down and what happens? And it turns out that proportional reasoning, or just understanding ratios, is at the foundation of fractions. Fractions are at the foundation of calculus. If you miss fractions in 3rd grade, you're kind of screwed for the rest of your math career. And this happens to a horrifying number of people. And I realized I didn't understand it either before I made this game. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is that making a game about something is one of the best ways to really comprehensively learn it. And that's another thing that we want to bring into classrooms. So one of the other things that we learned is we just can't build games fast enough. So we built a game about ratios, and it took us 6 months. That's one slice of one competency. Kids need 5 more, about the same concept. So we need lots of game developers, and that's one of the reasons why I go out and talk to people, because I really believe that these games can only be made by people who understand how to make fun games. They've been made by people who don't understand fun, and what you get is a game that nobody wants to play. If nobody wants to play it, then it's not going to go anywhere, and it's going to completely fail its mission. So one of the things that's revolutionary about Glasslab itself was that these educational systems, and even all the way up to ETS and Pearson and the Gates Foundation, were beginning to trust game developers in a way that they had never trusted them before. And I think that there's a massive change that's coming as more and more people start to fill this niche and understand something has to be engaging first. It has to be fun. But if it's going to be fun, it could be fun in lots of different ways. I never thought that I would make a game about ratios and proportions, but we made a cute game where there are little creatures that kind of throw up and poop if you feed them too much. And it's fun, but it actually has this concept of ratios at the core that we think could actually change kids' lives. So one of the things that's changing for us, this was just announced on Thursday, and I got to meet John Legend, which is weird and fun. He's very nice, is that our group is being absorbed into another group called LRNG. Actually, it's called Collective Shift. And our funders at the MacArthur Foundation have spun off what is now our CEO to create a new nonprofit to kind of take this idea and make it even bigger, and to create a bigger platform that really honors the way that kids want to learn. So it comes from a bunch of research and from some pretty horrifying statistics, such as the lowest tier of kids that graduate high school, or lowest tier of kids who are 24 years old. In low socioeconomic status areas, 9% of them will get college degrees, and in the highest tier, it's 95%. So that's the gap, which just continues to widen over time. And on top of that, our corporations as a country now actually spend more on corporate training than we spend on public education and on universities combined, which is shocking evidence of the gap the number of people we're leaving behind, the untapped potential, and the lack of equity in our system. So the MacArthur Foundation put $200 million over 10 years into this problem and trying to figure out how can you solve that engagement gap, how can you solve equity in education. And the net of it was this idea, this system called connected learning. And it's one of those things that we had to get it down in the science. There had to be a system and a theory for the whole thing that sounds really commonsensical, which is that for kids, they need their peers. They need people that are their age. They need to connect with them. They need to connect with them about things that they're authentically interested in. So they need to be able to select something and say, I love anime. I need to meet other kids who love anime. And then once we introduce them to their peers who have shared interests in an affinity space, then we bring in purpose. So we've kind of replaced this word academic with purpose. But to say, if you love anime, there are all kinds of things that you can do, that you can follow that interest, learn all these critical skills about shape and about design and about aesthetic and about marketing that go into that aesthetic of anime, but could leverage you into better places in the future. So let's see. People have asked, what about Glasslab? You guys don't know about Glasslab, so you wouldn't have asked this, but we are continuing our work as well, and we're trying to flatten the curve. So like I said, we need lots and lots of game developers, lots and lots of games. So we're trying to create a platform where you can take your game. You might not even know that it's educational, but some teacher has a purpose for it because they're going to use it as a shared metaphor. There are games that we kind of know have some sort of natural intuitive alignment, like SimCity or like Civilization. But there are other games that might teach procedural thinking. They might teach strategy. We used Plants vs. Zombies to teach problem solving. And so there are lots of ways that regular games that are entertaining can be used as engagement tools in classrooms. So we want to make it so that anybody can take a game that they've made. If they think it has some educational potential, we're going to give you a guide on how to go to a local teacher, talk to that teacher, see how it's used in school, get a lesson plan written. And once you have a test case of like, this was used in school with these 30 kids, all of a sudden the other teachers will believe you. And then you can upload your game to our system where you're going to get access to thousands of schools. So we were doing some very heavy assessment-based stuff, a lot of analysis, a lot of science, a lot of research. We're trying to now tamp that down and make it more accessible. So that instead of taking 2 months to integrate with our SDK, we're trying to get that down to 1 week to reduce the learning curve. We think we've got it. We have 2 developers now that have integrated in 1 week. And we're also trying to make our assessment smarter so that we have a data structure that was designed by one of our learning scientists that is built for games. So it takes units of gameplay, aligns those units of gameplay to learning competencies, and then uses an assessment at the end of those things. So it's a system within our SDK that is a standard data format that means that we can have instant reports about game progress and how they're aligned for teachers. So I'm pretty excited about that. I'm a little bit ahead of time, which is not shocking me, but I thought I would pause for questions here actually for a few minutes. Anybody have questions? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So the question was, how do we know that that test actually means something if we're doing a pre-test and a post-test? I'm not the person to answer that. We use our partners at ETS and Pearson to design those tests because it's what they do. And in the case of Mars Generation 1, we built the game from the beginning knowing that we were going to use a test called the C-ball, which was a test that ETS already had. So they kind of knew it was a baseline for argumentation. In Ratio Rancher, we were using questions from the NAEP, which is a math assessment. And then our learning designers created new questions that were from the NAEP that were similar to it that did not refer to any game knowledge. So you had to have the concept itself. Really good question, though. Mm-hmm. Can you say that in a different way? Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Uh-huh. Okay, so you're wondering how much the actual structure and the play of the game itself is sort of, you have to learn that stuff, and then in addition you have to learn the other stuff. Yeah, it's a lot. A lot of the process that we went through of learning how to make games, or learning how to make these kinds of games, was how we can flatten that as much as possible. Because if you're spending your whole time training the player how to use your interface, then you're not going to get to the concepts. And if the interface is blocking them from the concepts, you're not going to get there either. This is one of the reasons why when I describe these purpose-built competency-based games as kind of a master's level of game design, because, and also why we take a structure like Pokemon and say, okay, Pokemon's already solved this problem of how you kind of introduce this idea of creatures that you master and you learn them in battle. So we can count on a lot of pre-existing knowledge or pre-existing design, at least, to introduce kids to that thing so that we're not teaching them things that are not going to be useful to us. So there were sections of Mars Generation 1 that we cut out that we thought were really cool because we had to spend too much time training the player on how to do it rather than getting them directly into the concepts themselves. Yeah, Warren? Mm-hmm. Yeah, our initial games are middle school, and Ratio Rancher looks like it's younger than that and probably does hit 4th grade just because I think subconsciously we were aware that 4th grade is where kids fall off in proportional reasoning and nothing had been addressed, but we actually have it used in middle school and it has broad appeal. We focused on middle school because our initial grant mandate was middle school because there's a trough. So this is where kids tend to fall off, is right around 6th or 7th grade. And if they fall off in 6th or 7th grade, you don't get them back again. Whereas the earlier ages than that are pretty covered with educational software and pretty thorough. And older than that is really interesting, and we would like to do. I believe that those kinds of games will probably be substantially more complex because you have more of an adult audience. The competencies are more complex. But I don't know. We haven't really looked into it. The short answer to your question is because we didn't get funding to do that. Yeah. But if you know somebody, you know, we can. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
When you're evaluating these games for effectiveness, are you running a control condition where they're not playing the game, and what do they do?
We do. I'm trying to remember and how we've done it before. We run a control condition against a traditional instruction, but we are mainly measuring gains in pre and post from playing the game. So that control is not super important. The control is actually the pre-test that they're taking before they've played the game, and they play the game, and we have the same kids take them after. It's possible you would have some sort of organic increase, but that's kind of what the statistical analysis for is, to eliminate any sort of coincidental increase in skill. Warren again.
How are you getting these games in the hands of kids? Are they going out to 10,000 schools, or are you bringing kids to your lab to test them out? How are you getting them?
Distribution is one of the things that we're trying to solve. We actually have a sales team. We're working on getting into the state of New York, or we're talking to Florida, one district at a time. The way that you get, yeah, it's a gigantic problem. These systems are very inertia-based and entrenched. So you will tend to build relationships with schools one at a time over a period of 5 to 10 years, and then you're in all the schools, and then you're the incumbent. So we were trying to see if we could disrupt that system by saying anybody can sign up, but it's not that simple because you have administrators that are blocking you and superintendents and politicians all along the way. So what we hope to do is to do that work, which is going to take a very long time, of getting into schools. One of the things that's exciting about LRNG is that LRNG already reaches 100,000 kids, so that gives us a big increase. But we hope to do that work, become the incumbent, but then have an open platform where anybody can make a game that can then get distributed to that network of all of those schools. And then we have rating systems on the game like Steam that allow it to percolate up. So if you have a good game, you can reach hundreds of thousands of kids very quickly. That's probably 5 or 6 years away. Yeah. Over here.
Can you talk a little bit more about like how, as a game developer, you get into your network? Like, let's say I want to make an educational game.
Mm-hmm.
I go class, like stuff. Like, how would I go approach you guys?
Yeah, you can email me, actually. It's that simple. And we also have, you can go to glasslabgames.org, and I believe it's developer.glasslabgames.org to get information about how our developers sign up, and then we have a mailing list. We have been throttling our developer access so far, but very soon we're going to be making it publicly accessible, so all you have to do is download the SDK. Actually, you can already download the SDK and integrate it, and if someone was as gung-ho as to do that and then talk to us, we probably would put the game up if it was good. Yeah. Warren? Yeah, we worry about that a lot. And we try to make things gender neutral, and we will test with girls and boys in different environments in our early development for our own games. But this generation of kids is not really particular. It's really inspiring, actually. The girls socially will say they love games, and they'll play games. They'll get really attached. We do things that are more subtle. So Mars Generation 1 very deliberately has a cast of human characters that's very diverse and has women in strong positions, and that helps. You can choose a female avatar, which makes a big difference. But gender bias, any kind of bias, is a huge issue when you're talking about public education, for sure. Yes, we have data published on Mars Generation 1. I'm not sure that we have data from, we have Mars Generation 1 and SimCity. I'm not sure that the Ratio Rancher data is actually published yet. I think we have certain findings that are published, but not the papers themselves. There was also a study that SRI did, Stanford Research Institute, on our methods as a whole, which is also published, and all of that's up on glasslabgames.org. So they would not be supporting, I mean, I'm sure that they have money, but they don't make any investment in game development. There are agencies that do, and we have, if you go to design.glasslabgames.org, we actually have kind of a manual that shows, here's where the grant funding exists that has been historically applied to games. We went to the NSF because they have a grant called the Advancing Informal Learning in STEM, which not only is applicable for games, but also is large enough. Part of the problem with grant funding is that it's just not built for the scales of game development. So you could get $10,000, but that's not going to help you very much. So the larger grants are kind of what we focused on.
As far as your educational games, are you pretty much emphasizing mostly on younger kids and education, or what about like maybe adult education, like things like media skills, financial skills, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, we actually are bringing on board in January a financial literacy game from one of our partners. It's kid-oriented because of our mandate initially, and also because it's hard to find educational games for adults. It's like this weird market space that people don't really understand. They understand language learning, and they understand fitness learning. So there's certain things that they'll say, okay, that adults can learn these things. But for some reason, adults don't want to learn math. They don't want to learn, you know, some of these core skills. I think it's a really interesting space, and I wish that we had more of a culture of learning in the, you know, in the world. Mm-hmm.
How do you find a balance between education and fun?
Oh God, that's really hard. I mean, what we try to do, to answer seriously, is so with both argumentation and with ratios, what I did as a game designer is I got somebody to teach me these things and to kind of come at me very assertively with what I didn't know. So to go through a sort of Socratic education process about it. And then I tried to internalize what is it about that thing that's actually kind of intrinsically fun. And so with Mars Generation 1, the thing that's fun about argumentation is that you can beat people. You know, it's fun to win an argument. And so we try to find the things within the learning itself that is already fun and ramp those up and make them exaggerated and clear so that the competencies, and you actually would naturally want to acquire the competencies. And we found that was true. When you give a kid a robot and say, you have to equip this robot with evidence in order to beat the other robot, you don't have to explain anything else. They're like, okay, show me the evidence. Oh, why is that evidence bad? No, I have to get this other evidence instead. You know, so we're trying to find those natural leverage points and then insert the competencies into them. I should probably move on. Yep, I'm right on time to move on. So we'll go into the next part of the talk here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about remote teams because my team is 100% distributed. And well, we're not 100%. We're pretty close. We don't actually ever see each other. But I do think that it's the way of the future. So I was talking about the NOAA Climate Jam. This is a picture of Kim Unger, who was at the NOAA Climate Jam. And we got Lively Ivy there, which was awesome. And a team from Glasslab was there. A team from Phenomena was there. I love Phenomena, so I was so excited about that. And we were at the Cal Academy of Sciences, which is this amazing venue in Northern California. So Kim, her team was completely virtual. And when I told the jam organizers this, they were like, we don't want it virtual, that's weird. And I said, no, trust me, it's going to be awesome. Because I think that these virtual teams are a big part of the future. Because if it's really important to meet with peers that share your interests, they might not be in your city. They might not be in your neighborhood. They might be all over the place. And so I think there's a lot that we have to solve to make these teams work really well. But they're definitely part of the future. Kim has worked for 10 years with people from all over the world. One of her programmers is in Finland, and several of the people she's worked with, she's never met before, which I thought was astonishing. So she actually is probably the person who should be talking about this, about how to build a remote team. She kind of is this amazing orchestrator as a producer designer herself. She brings pieces together, goes to different people for the pieces, and has this like big hive mind of all these people that she works with. It's really, really cool. I will say that it's hard, and there are more problems, I think, right now than there are solutions. So one of the problems is that creating company culture is really hard. You have to go way out of your way because people are not, they're not there with you. Culture will naturally emerge from a place where people are coming every day, and you can't rely on that with a remote team. So getting into a working flow state is really difficult. So if you've made games in person in one location, you develop a flow with people. People understand what everybody else is doing. I bet that there's probably some measurable cognitive thing that's going on, which you don't get when you're in a remote team. Actually, you can sometimes get it if you're trying to fix something that's on fire on your server. So I've seen flow state emerge when there's an emergency, but not other than that. Different individuals will handle remote work differently. So I think one of the big challenges is how do you sort for people that are actually going to work well in that environment and kind of honor the way that they're going to want to work. So it can be difficult if you have somebody you know is really good and they want to work for you and you say, we just understand that you're probably not going to do well if you're in your house all day. Some people are good with that and some people aren't. And there's way more friction to communication. So especially, I feel this very painfully for me as a designer because I want to be able to just walk to somebody's desk and say, hey, I have a crazy thing I want to do. Is it too crazy or is it crazy enough? And I can't have those conversations as seamlessly if I have to say, like, are you there on Slack? Are you getting a donut? What's going on? So there's more friction. But I do think that all of these problems are problems that you would have anyway. And I like that this talk made me look up this scene from Pirates of the Caribbean because I remembered again, like, who the heck is the Chinese pirate queen? And I looked her up on the internet. She's real, which just blew my mind this morning. So you learn something if you Google the Chinese pirate queen from Pirates of the Caribbean. There are problems that you would have anyway. If you kind of are being lazy about your company culture in an in-person environment, that's also going to be really bad. So in some ways, a lot of the problems actually just force you to focus on things that you should be focusing on anyway. And there's a trade-off. So if you have a location-based community, your culture as a company that's fully remote will be very different. But that's okay. And you can kind of embrace this as like your pirate band of people that are going to be individualists, and they're going to like tell you they don't want to do what you want them to do a lot of the time. And you can't kick them out of the office because they're already where they are. So the other things that you'll run into are setting clear expectations, and that's a problem in an office regularly anyway. On-site company culture will develop issues where you're going to ignore problems because you like people. That's going to happen when you're remote, and it's going to be harder to solve. But ultimately, you'll learn more from working through those problems, and probably even would develop a better on-site experience from doing this sort of hard mode of remote team. So some of the things that we do at Sense of Wonder to create culture, I do stupid things. I made everybody pick an animal name because we're supposed to be about creating a sense of wonder in the world. So we want to make our company culture about the values we want to give to our players. And so rather than having senior programmer, we have programming meerkat and programming lemur. And I'm trying to think, and my co-founder is Chief Code Monkey, which is where this came from. So he started Chief Code Monkey, and I said, well, I can be the design giraffe, and I later decided I wanted to be the design oryx. So it's a stupid thing, but it's playful, and it helps people create an identity, and they actually kind of have a place and a way to introduce themselves to the rest of the team as to why they picked. My latest person picked cassowary. I was like, oh, okay, you're a cassowary. She's like, they're ferocious. I'm like, okay, I believe you. So I do think that it's important to get together in person often. This could be really difficult if you have an international team, but I do think that it's really important to get everybody together in the same place. Especially when you bring new people onto the team, they have to meet each other face to face. It's just different. The communication becomes a lot easier after you have that in-person meeting, so it's totally worth it, even though it can be expensive. And then as a leader, as somebody who's in charge of the company, you have to be thinking constantly about that company culture and how to create it and how to recognize the humanity and the personhood of all the people that are working for you and say, is it working? How could I make it better? And again, these are things that you probably should be doing for your company anyway. So there are certain things about creating culture that we can look at just the history of humanity about. People want to belong to a tribe. They want a tribal identity. They want an identity inside the tribe, and they want ritual. So the more that you can kind of think about these really big ideas and create really small examples of them, I think the more cohesive your company culture is going to be. I will say that these are all theories since we're still kind of a work in progress. But there are a lot of benefits too. And as a small organization, you're going to be really flexible. You can be really creative. I could not have given my people animal names at Zynga. Well, I could have, but it wouldn't have. Anyway, I might have gotten fired. So if you challenge yourself to design things for your company the way that you would design things for a game, I mean, game developers are creative people. There are lots of creative things you can come up with. You have to really kind of embrace that idea that we can do whatever the heck we want. So why not do something surprising and fun? The other thing is to make time to talk about the company with your company. So to say, how are we doing? Are you guys happy? You know, this is kind of a standard thing to do in a company, but also just to kind of tap into their creativity and get them invested in ownership of ideas that the company might do. What do you guys think would be fun? Should we buy something? Should we get together? If we were going to spend $500, how should we spend it? If you can pull people into those conversations, you'll start to get them feeling like they own the company. I don't know why I left my business card on this one, sorry. Setting expectations is incredibly important, and one of the big things that I've learned is if you're running a remote company, if you think something might be a problem, it's already a problem. It was probably a problem 3 weeks ago and you're just now figuring it out. So you have to really listen to your instincts as a leader to say, if something doesn't feel right to me, to really engage with your co-founders and say, this doesn't feel right to me, we need to have a conversation about it. And it's also important to meet with your fellow leadership, even if you're 4 people, you know, and you're all leaders, to meet together and say, what are the problems that we have? How might we fix them? What do you guys want to be better? Where are we going as a company? What are we building? What is, you know, if we have a 2-year plan, even if it's just a conversation that we have, what is that plan? And do we really feel like we're all moving in the same direction? And I'll say that structure is actually your friend. I think people that want to work on remote teams, especially independent companies, you know, when there's nobody telling us what we have to do, we don't want to do anything that seems like it's lame or part of a company. I had a heck of a time getting my team to agree to meet for a daily stand-up on Google Hangout. They were programmers, they were shy, they didn't want to get on video. And so we said, okay, you guys can check in, but if you have to check in by 10 a.m. every morning and tell us what you're doing. And sure enough, they didn't want to do that either. So I kind of let them fail at it for a few times and said, okay, we're going back to Google Hangout. And it was structure, and they didn't like it. But the result was that we saw each other every day, we worked together a lot better, we started communicating better, and people got more things done. So sometimes you have to be the bad guy and say, this is something that actually just needs to be done, even though we're a pirate band and all of you can tell me to go away. So, mission-driven games. So kind of coming back to some of the stuff that I was talking about earlier. I have kind of a pet peeve, which I'm exposing you guys to because Casey gave me a microphone. So these games historically have been called serious games. If you Google serious games, this is what you get. I really like Google Image as a way of like capturing a semiotic space of something. So Google serious games, you get a bunch of charts. And they make me really grumpy, so I put grumpy cat all over them. So the whole idea of serious games, like, it makes me frustrated. I'm sorry if anybody's kind of invested in that, but it's like, what does that even mean? What kind of games aren't serious? Like, what is it? How can you tell that a game is serious? And it's very confusing. So I really advocate the term mission-driven instead, because everybody likes missions. This is from James Bond. You know, you want to get a mission, you want to be set in a direction, you want to have a purpose. And I think the big difference between these terms, and you know, people don't like to argue about terms, but I think one of the very strong things about it is that mission-oriented implies a quantifiable outcome. And I also think that that's one of the things that's been missing from the serious game space. It's great for them to be like artistic or purpose-driven games, or even, you know, talk about games for change. That's terrific. But I think we're making a distinction if we say this is a mission-driven game, that it's going to have an outcome, and I'm going to tell you how I'm going to measure that outcome. So I'm going to make something, see if it measured up, and if it didn't measure up, I'm going to be able to take something back and say, here's what we're going to change next time so that we get closer to our goal. Because I think that sense of progress has been missing from the community. So let's see. I'm going to talk a little bit about a design theory that I have because it's fun to talk about. I think Ian has already seen it, so you can get a coffee or something if you want. But it's called Sophia, and it's the core of what I think I've learned from making learning games, which is one type of mission. There are lots of different missions. I saw that there's a game about AIDS awareness out in the expo, which is awesome. So Raf Koster likes that I give this talk because I said that his book is, I think, the best book on game design, which I think that's a very polarizing statement. But it had this insight in it that was so comprehensive, and it went so far that I think you can make an argument that if you're going to at least pick the top 5 games, or game books, this is probably one of them. And also, I photoshopped his head onto a saint. So he likes that too. I actually wanted to use this at GDC, but I didn't. I used the wrong email and I didn't get his permission. So he said that's what games are in the end, is teachers, and fun is just another word for learning. And it kind of echoed throughout the game industry. People say, oh yeah, fun is just another word for learning. Of course, that's what fun is, because we'd argued for decades over what fun was. And what he was doing was actually bringing early child psychology into game design in a way that if anybody had done before, they hadn't done it in such a way that it was just fully captured. And we said, okay, yeah, that's right. And he was coalescing the work of a lot of people. This is Jim G in the top, I guess it'll be you guys' right, who has a book called What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy, which is probably the one book, if you're only going to read one book about learning games, this is probably the book you should read. This would be Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is not shown, but his book Flow is another one of the great books for game designers. He describes the flow state that you get into when you're really playing a game and you're in the flow of a video game, or in the flow of learning anything, actually. And that goes back to what Piaget and Vygotsky talked about and what I call the depth hierarchy of nerddom on fun. So you can start at the top, and Jesse Stahl says fun doesn't matter, so he kind of just bombs away this discussion. Ralph Koster says fun is learning. Jim G says fun is the scientific method, which is a fascinating idea. Fred Rogers says play is the work of childhood, and you could substitute Csikszentmihalyi in there. Piaget says play is assimilation without adaptation, and that there are three kinds of play: practice, symbolic, and rules-based, so you're going deeper. And Vygotsky says play is a self-actualizing tool of the mind that maximizes the zone of proximal development. So if you were to keep digging into that, you would get more and more larger words, and probably to neuroscience, where you would lose everybody. But when I said we were excited about SimCity, it was because of what Raph said. It was because fun is learning. Like, okay, well, if fun is learning, then clearly if we brought video games into the classroom, we're just going to win everything. It's going to be super easy. And we got SimCity. And so we thought, no problem, just time to revolutionize education. This is going to be really simple. But we should have been actually really quite worried. So then, like I said, kids said this is pretty fun, but we're not learning anything. And if you think about that in the context of Raph's work, it just blows everything up. I said, wait a minute, how can we be having fun and not learning if fun and learning are the same thing? And so we realized that his statement was the beginning of a path. It wasn't this sort of epiphany. It kind of, at the time in game design, it felt like it was this big epiphany. But instead, it was the tip of an iceberg. And then over the next 3 years building these projects, I got to watch a lot of really excellent teachers at work and to see what was really going on. So these are actually pictures of kids playing our games, and what's going on here is something, it's not fun. So I designed commercial games for 14 years before this, and I didn't see this emotion. I saw something else. I saw kids jumping out of their seats. I saw them throwing things. I saw them fighting over controllers. You know, all this is fun, right? This is when we're having fun, this is what we do. But this is something else. And ultimately, at the end of the day, game designers, I think, as artists, are painters of emotion. And so when you see a new emotion, it's like, holy crap. And I was seeing several instances of this same repeatable but very elusive and kind of mysterious emotion. And I got really obsessed with it. So who knows who Paul Ekman is? Oh, cool. Warren knows who Paul Ekman is. And a couple of people. Who's seen Inside Out? Yeah, okay. So if you've seen Inside Out, you actually have seen the work of Paul Ekman. So he was a psychologist who he was researching emotion theory. Sorry, I guess my white text doesn't show up hardly at all in there. He took photographs of people expressing emotion all around the world and then had them label what they saw. And then he was categorizing all of these emotions and trying to find universal emotions. He found initially 6, and then he added 7. This is the show Lie to Me, which was also based on his work. And Inside Out mapped his emotions. They left out surprise, which really horrifies me because I think it might be the most important emotion, at least for game design. But you have disgust, contempt, which was new, sadness, happiness, fear, anger, and surprise. So it was some of the first work that actually categorized emotion into universals and things that we could talk about and maybe try to measure and discuss. But I didn't see fun here. I didn't see learning either, which you also can't see because it's in blue. Sorry about that. It didn't seem to be any of these universal emotions, which I had found Paul Ekman's work in my learning designer. I asked him, what is this weird emotion that I'm seeing? And I said, wait, has anybody done any work on universal emotion? He said, well, Ekman has. So fun and learning seem to be a little bit of all of them, each in a different order. So it was, sometimes it was discussed. There's lots of gross things in games, I don't know why. 14-year-olds thrive on contempt, I can tell you. Sadness, everybody knows Final Fantasy VII and Era. Sadness is a part of fun. Happiness is definitely seems to be pretty close. Fear is definitely present in video games, especially with challenge. You get a lot of fear. And surprise seem to be the closest thing. Anger, definitely. Anybody who's played League of Legends knows anger. What I realized was that fun wasn't one emotion, it was a process between many, but that process seemed to be playing out in this reliable fashion when you look at gameplay through the lens of universal emotion. And that process, which again, I don't know if you can see this, I call Sophia, which is a cognitive mechanical process by which we convert fear into happiness through surprise. So you must begin afraid and uncertain, then you start to get a little bit of traction and you have a moment of insight, a moment of surprise, I get it. And then you have this deep sense of happiness. And let's see, people say where did Sophia came from? It comes from the Philean Sophia, or philosophy, love of wisdom. So surprise subsection. Let's talk about microbes. How many microbes live in your body? Lots. 2 million? What was it? Some guesses? About 2 million? Yeah, 100 trillion. So you're carrying around about 6 pounds of microbes, so you can tell that to somebody if they want you to lose weight. So it's my microbes. Microbes, they outnumber human cells 10 to 1. So in the cells of your body, you are more microbe than you are human cells. There are tons of them that are still unidentified, and when you blink, you're disrupting about 200 species on the surface of your eye. The scientists call it the second genome. How do you feel about that? Not great. Gross. Yeah, it's like, oh man, do not want. But if you think about it, the Milky Way has about 100 billion stars, and your microbiome has 100 trillion microbes. So all these microbes are working together in something that's like 1,000 galaxies together in your body to kind of create what you are. And this is leading to some really fascinating science. So red meat actually changes your gut bacteria. Scientists that were looking into heart disease found a weird thing. And again, this is science, so doing weird things. They decided to feed a steak to a vegan and see what would happen. So it turns out, if you feed a steak to a person who eats meat, they get a bloom of a chemical that causes your arteries to harden. If you feed a steak to a vegan, no bloom. Weird, really weird. So vegans actually could eat steak and not encounter heart disease if they went back to being vegans after that. And the reason why we now think that this is the case is that there's a colony of gut bacteria that, when they eat red meat in your gut, produce this bloom of chemical. So if you don't eat meat regularly, the bacteria dies out. So it gets the red meat, and all of a sudden, there's no bloom of that chemical, no hardening of your arteries. So it's an entirely new kind of science, and there's all kinds of things that are being blown open because of it. So that's the second genome. And it means that your body is more like a coral reef than it is like a single entity. And it's a way in which we are literally connected to everything else, because we are these cities of microbiomes inside of us. How do you feel now? Better, yeah, see? It's better. So that's Sophia. That's this process of encountering something in the world that is foreign and alarming, and saying, whoa, this does not fit my world model. And then beginning to incorporate it and digest it into your world model, and then reaching a point of happiness and growth at the other side of it. And so as I started to work into this more, because I presented it at GDC, I guess a year and a half ago now, I started to, people said, you have to develop this further. So I said, okay, we can actually chart an arc that's a little bit more rich than just one thing. It's not just a loop, it's not just one mechanical process. You actually begin with curiosity, and I think that curiosity deepens into anxiety as you start to realize what you don't know. Eventually you should hit a point where you feel threat, where you feel like, okay, this is actually kind of existential and I really don't like it. And then you encounter stress as you're fighting that sense of threat. And eventually you should also encounter failure. You should kind of say, oh, I can't do it, I can't do it. But then you reach tenacity. By breaking through your failure, you get to a point of tenacity, and then that tenacity leads you to surprise and insight, and then you're at the peak experience in that moment of insight, which then settles down into mastery. And then you have to experience that whole thing all over again. And this is actually, I think, the emotional learning process. So in practical mission-driven design, what we had to do was figure out what was the pain and threat in argumentation. Again, I apologize for my white text here. So we had to figure out what it's like to be bad at arguing and start there. And if you think about what it's like to be bad at arguing, it's actually not that hard. You feel stupid, you feel confused, you feel like you can't influence people, you feel like people don't like you, you feel unpopular. It's like, oh man, those are some pretty bad feelings. And what we wanted to do was design an emotional transition where we took each of those emotions and transmuted them into something else. So if you felt confused, we wanted you to become clear. If you felt powerless, we wanted you to feel powerful. If you felt unpopular, we wanted you to feel charismatic. And if you felt stupid, you should feel like a genius. This is the transition that we want you to make when you're playing the game. And our message to kids was, if you learn to argue well and you use evidence, because the thing that middle school teachers told us was kids never use evidence and they don't know what it is, then, actually that might be true for people in general, that's probably, you'll become convincing, popular, and powerful. And then from a kid's perspective, the pain point in argumentation is that it's super confusing and it feels like this labyrinth. It's super complex. And it's really subjective. So if I make an argument and somebody tells me I'm wrong, if I don't understand the way evidence works, I just feel powerless and kind of unpopular. So we thought about what is a game that is naturally complex and where complexity is part of the fun, because we couldn't take the complexity out of argumentation. It was always going to be complex. And we landed on Pokemon. Pokemon is heinously complex. And if you've seen kids play it, it's remarkable because they're doing these really fast calculations, crazy amounts of math when they're playing the card game. And competing with each other and rules lawyering each other and mastering all kinds of really complex relationships between the Pokemon. But kids love it anyway, even though there's all that complexity and all that computation. They're doing a crap load of math, and in the case of the video game, a lot of reading, but they still love it. So the important thing to remove from argumentation was not the complexity, it was the abstractness. We needed to make it really concrete. And so what we did was we took our Argybots and we said each Argybot is going to represent a form of argument. So there's an Authoritron, which represents an argument from authority. There's an Observatron, which is an argument by observation. And then we gave them rules for how they could master each of these forms of argument. They would actually find the robots inside the game, figure out how to equip them with the right kind of evidence, and figure out if they're facing off against an Authoritron, what are the critical questions they need to do to defeat that robot and to expose holes in its argument. The result was the kids said things like boom, and KO, and OMG. And data was inconsistent, it wasn't supported. I'm like, yes, that's right. And they would say that with the same affect as they would say KO and fight. And these kids actually did a good amount of fighting over the iPad, which was great. So this approach to argumentation was concrete and exciting and accessible. And it was still complex, but it was masterable and it was relatable. So within the arc of Sophia, we took them from a place of abstractness and confusion and actually leaned into that and say, you're going to be in a complex world. It's going to be full of things, and you're going to have to master them, and it's going to be hard. And you're going to fail. The first battle that you're in, you're going to fail, which is an old JRPG concept. And initially, you're going to feel like you can't master it. There's too many. But then we're going to give you that moment of tenacity and winning and say, okay, I actually can master this. I'm going to get more robots. I'm going to get more evidence. I'm going to collect all the evidence. And then once you've collected all the evidence, you do figure out how to equip that robot and how to make it defeat the other robots that are in the game. So you have this feeling of mastery emerging out of the confusion. So that's Sophia. So I actually want to talk about what you guys are passionate about. So I have kind of an exercise. I'm going to make you talk to each other. Sorry. And what I want you to do is just turn to the people near you and say, what is something about the world you wish was different? Telepathic communication? Oh man, that's intense. Okay. That was the group discussion? Oh, okay, I see. Cool.
I want more people to be self-motivated.
More people to be self-motivated. That's an awesome one. Yeah? Huh?
Less money in politics.
Less money in politics. I've got a game for you, actually. Yeah. Basic economics? Yeah, that's one that comes. It's funny, that one comes up in game designers a lot. Really interesting.
Basically income inequality.
Income inequality, yeah, I like it.
More people are valuing critical thinking.
Critical thinking? Cool. We hope that Mars Generation 1 did that. Yeah.
Better sex education.
More sex education. I have not seen games for that, which is interesting. You would think that that would be an easy topic, but I guess maybe not. Yeah, it could be scary. For labels not to divide people as much? Yeah, that's interesting. So kind of like break down the tribalism a little bit. Yeah. That's cool. I love it. Thank you, guys. So now that you've thought about that, if you could distill that concept, say like I want to change income inequality, or I want to change labels, or I want to change sex ed, what is the behavior that people who don't have that thing do, and how would you change it into a different behavior? What would that transition look like? So when I talk to learning designers and subject matter experts, I was talking to somebody about social justice recently, because we're working on it for LRNG. It actually, if you talk to an expert and say, what is the one behavior for a 16-year-old that you want to change, they will go, it just blows their mind. So it's a really fun question to ask people. How can you actually take something that's a really big problem and find one behavior? But the thing is, if you can find one behavior, you can probably make a game or an experience or a message or something that addresses one behavior. And that's what we try to do with our games. And then the other question is, what group could you join that's nearby that actually is associated with that? Where can you talk to people about that? Because I really think that social change comes from people having conversations with each other, from doing what you just did. But you have to find people that share that interest, people that innately you can connect with about that issue. If you care about it, you should, because why not? You know, we watch television. So, and then if you could make a game about it, what fun game, what game that's already fun, would analog to that issue? Or somebody said something? Yeah. So a lot of the economic simulators, we have economics in lots of different games. How could you kind of map that? That's actually one of the easier ones. Sex ed, you got me thinking about that one. I think a dating sim would be what you would do. So I don't know, that's one idea. So if you can take a topic, you can think, there's a genre of games. Games are now mature enough that we don't have to just invent mechanics out of nothing. We can actually say, I can make an RPG, but make it about argumentation, and just twist it a little bit. And you get a game that can have a really powerful mission. There was something else. I don't know what to do about the telepathy one. I'm going to have to think about that. So,
just put a tiny self-thought on everyone.
So that's kind of what I would say. If you want to go from having an idea about something and caring about something, going from ideas to action is really simple. It really is just finding that one simple thing and saying, I'm going to iterate on that. I really care about it. I care about it so much that I'm going to join a group. If it's an online group, it could be a Facebook group. There are Facebook groups about these interests. And say, I'm going to learn more about it. And I'm going to put it in the back of my brain and really think about it. And think about how my skills as a game developer, which are remarkable skills, can be leveraged to accomplish even the smallest change in one person. Because the way that we accomplish big change in a social space is to iterate over and over again. You're building relationships over a long time. Sense of Wonder is playing an exhaustingly long game. We are over 3 years in, and we've got one game and grants and a team, and it's really hard. But because we believe in what we want to do, we're constantly looking for those opportunities. And we're in, like I said, a second phase with the NSF where it's going to take another year to get back. But eventually, if that pays off, it'll pay off for us big. We've got the team that's ready. We've got the server that's ready. We've got the technology. We're in the right place, I hope. So, and work on making yourself a better leader and a better business hacker every day. So look at the business of games. Look at the business of social impact as a hacker, as somebody who is a gamer, and someone who is really good at finding flaws in systems, finding the place, the leverage point to really get in there and change something. That's what finding that one behavior is about. It's actually about hacking human behavior. And then also, again, iterate. Do it over and over again. If you really care about it, find those people who care about it and stick with them. So I actually think that this leads to the secret of quality of life, which is my second secret subsection that I didn't tell you about. I really think that it comes back to this concept of connected learning. I think that it's about your peers, which in the case of remote teams are your coworkers. It's about caring about them as people. It's about bringing peers into your space that share your interests, or finding those peers and bringing them together, or joining a group that actually really shares your idea for how the world could be a better place. And it's about connecting your shared interest to a sense of purpose, which goes straight back to Maslow. It's good to be interested in something. It's good to have peers and friends that are interested in something. If you can really convert that relationship into a mission, you start to get a really powerful sense of self. And everything that we know about people says that that's true. And you can say, do I have to make educational games? Because I don't want to. No, absolutely not. It's perfectly okay not to. And in fact, if you don't want to, you really shouldn't, because it's not going to work. But consider that the world is a system. The world is a game-like system that you, as someone who is game literate, have ways of understanding that other people don't. That way of finding leverage points, of being able to map an entire system and say, when these 3 things happen, it's because of these 4 causes that interrelate in this way. Gamers are terrific at that kind of complex systems thinking. And if you can do that, you can distill out a leverage point that somebody else might not think of because they don't have that skill. So that's what I would say. It's just kind of experiment with your thinking. And as an intelligent person and a member of society, think about where those leverage points are and what you could push up against, even if it's just by saying something. And I would close by saying that I genuinely believe that game makers are the most powerful agents of social change, potentially. I think that our ability to reach people and to make an idea and make an experience viral is incredibly powerful. It's something that all of the people that are fighting for social issues want, and they don't know how to get. Game developers know how to do it. They know how to make you do something that you didn't know you wanted to do, and for no reason. So if we can do things that make you do things for no reason, we could also make you do things that actually do have a reason behind them. So, and that's actually it. I was hoping to kind of do Q&A for 15 minutes, so that's it.
So when you make an education game, you basically get the general aspects of a certain topic, and the people who usually get the most knowledge are the people who create the game. So have you thought about implementing some sort of way to have that within education where you're actually having classes on how to make games?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a big part of the future. The Cal Academy of Sciences did a teen jam before we did the climate jam, and it was specifically about that, to bring kids together to learn about science through creative games. And we didn't even tell them we want you to learn about science, we just said come and learn how to make games. It was very, very powerful. One of the side projects that I did last year was led to the Cal Humanities project that we're working on, because again, it's iteration, it was really slow. I made an informed game called the Time Society Chronicles that was a little text-based game about the Boston Massacre, where kids would kind of go around and encounter things, do a little adventure. And what we found out really quickly, because I had a friend who piloted it in a classroom in New Jersey, was that the kids wanted to make the game. So I actually worked with him on getting some, I think he wound up using Eagle Writer, because we tried Inform, and Inform was too hard for the kids at first. But I think if you have them play a game and then build their own game and something that's very related to it, it's very powerful. So now a big part of our Cal Humanities application is actually using the mud space of the text game to allow kids to create places inside the game itself and try to create mechanics as well as part of that experience. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I'm very passionate about it. Other questions?
So a lot of these games you make, you use them for like education for kids. At some point, do any of the kids like sort of think, okay, are they trying to trick me or something? Are they?
You know what? You know what's really funny is if the game is really engaging, if it's really polished and the experience is good, there's like so much that we know about user experience and about the flow, the first time user experience and all of that. If you make the game really good, what they will be suspicious of is that they're not learning. So, for instance, in Ratio Venture, we did have to kind of tutorialize a lot of the things about how you feed the animals, and then you're feeding the animals in a pen. And we had a girl in the classroom who kept saying, is this math? Are we doing math? When are we going to do math? And eventually, once she hit the actual challenge point in the game, which was like level 7 or something like that, she's like, oh, now it's math. And that moment is really great, because at that point she's already bought it. She's already going to keep playing and finish the game, but now we actually want you to consciously think at a certain point, yes, it's math. So they will be suspicious, and actually the same teacher who piloted my Time Society game also tested Mars Generation 1 in his classroom. And when he gets kids to play games, he gets his kids to play games all the time, and a lot of them are pretty bad. And so they get this expectation that educational games are bad. But he told us recently that when he gets them to play a new game, if he knows that it's good, he'll say it's like Mars Generation 1, it's not like this other thing. So there is a skepticism, and it's especially in middle school. It's really interesting.
Then actually, have you ever gotten pushback from educators? Like,
Oh yeah, all the time, all the time. Yeah. It's weird, actually. We get the most pushback from the educators we're not really worried about, which is good. We get pushback from educators in wealthy communities that think that video games are the enemy still. It's interesting because the lower SES are very willing to embrace technology. So hopefully that's hopeful, and this is a balancing effect.
Why is it important that the kids know that they're learning math or whatever?
Yeah, so the question was, why is it important that the kids know that they're learning math? We didn't do that on purpose, so I wouldn't say, that's an interesting question. I would say in part, it's because when kids are in school, for the most part, if they've got a good teacher, they're there to learn, and they want to learn. So when she was saying this isn't math, she was making a complaint. And I think that if you don't have that moment of transference into this is why math is good, then you're not doing a full service to your competency. So if you don't ever think that now I understand why this skill is powerful, you're missing a piece of the education that it's possible to give them, because what you want is for them to finish playing that game and say, now I think about math differently, and now I might like math more than I did before. So if you haven't done that, you can deliver a competency, but you're kind of missing an opportunity, I would say.
It's also important too because then they'll be able to apply that competency in
Right.
another situation. It's transfer. So, but you have to actually recognize the competency for what it is in order to be able to transfer it to a new situation.
Yeah, so the comment you guys said, Kachuk, was that it's really important to be able to transfer that competency into another experience, and that's absolutely right. If you haven't achieved transfer is the big thing that they talk about in educational games. It's a little bit like what was the point? So they were better at that game, but if I give them some other experience, if they can't use that as an analogy, if they can't transfer it to other experiences, then it's a closed system. It's not actually going to impact them. So one of the things we were really excited about was we had kids who would start to use Argue Out Academy terminology on the playground. And that was one of our metrics for if they were calling each other on. You don't have evidence for that. That's not good. Any other questions? You guys have been with me a long time. Yeah.
So on top of people having to be intelligent and creative for the game industry, how do you keep people motivated also to be compassionate with their mission in making games without giving up, in lieu of money or finding better jobs or opportunities? I mean, that feeds into the reason why you guys work virtually, because you share common interests. But how do you keep finding those people and motivating them?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you motivate people to make mission-based games? I think you have to find them naturally. I think that you have to talk to a lot of people, and as you talk to people, you get people who really light up when you describe what you're doing. And one of the things, so I actually came to Glasslab because I was working on Sense of Wonder, which had an aligned mission, and I was getting advice from some of the people involved. And I got lunch with Katie Salin, and who's one of the great people in games and education. And she told me that the most important thing, if you're doing mission-driven work, is to not go for the people that are necessarily the best of the best at a thing, but the people who are the most passionate about what you're doing. Because those people will stick with you, and they'll see it through the hard parts. And I think that's true of both your team and your funders and your subject matter experts. You might have a subject matter expert that's the top Harvard, whatever, but if that person is not deeply passionate about making sure you make the best thing possible, you're not going to get enough of their time and their interest.
There's a lot of educational games that are bad, so there's kind of a stigma there, and I think that's related to there's a little bit of a stigma of being in educational games among the game development community.
Yeah.
That there's kind of this cultural belief that if you're going into educational games because you couldn't cut it,
You're a washout.
and yet, making games for with a mission, as you put it, is actually harder than a harder problem, because you don't just have to make it fun, you have other things too. And so you really need to get people who know what they're doing, even though it's probably the people who don't know what they're doing as well that are going to be driven towards that space. And do you see a way out of that? Like, how do we get the best people in industry really excited about mission-based games?
So the question was, how do we get the best people in games really passionate about mission-based games, given the stigma of the serious games legacy of the games not being very good and the people that are working on them not being the best? I think you get people like Warren Spector to make educational games. I think we need exemplars is the thing, and I think we're fighting for exemplars. I think that when I go out and talk about Mars Generation, when it's like, yeah, it's not as exciting about Diablo, I guess, to you guys, but here's something that's different. And I think it's really important to carve out that niche as a new innovation space within design, rather than something that's supposed to compete and be more fun than a game. This is one of the things that we learned through Glasslab. There was an initial statement that Glasslab was going to make games that are as engaging as the most expensive commercial game, which was stupid, right? Because we had 4 people in a room, right? There was no way that we were going to do that. So I think, though, if we were to reframe it and say, we're innovators, and the reason why the history of educational games is so bad is because the history of everything that's just getting started is bad. And so what we have to do is find the right people that can really push it to another level. And if you call game developers like lazy or cowardly, it does actually get a rise out of them often. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you guys so much for coming.